The history of the Norwegian Counter-Strike scene, going right back into the original iteration of Counter-Strike, is an entirely tragic one overall. When you consider the great players they had, sometimes the teams they had that were potential contenders for world championships, they should have been one of the absolute greatest countries in the history of Counter-Strike. Perhaps even second to the mighty Sweden, which obviously was, by the end, far out front in first place because how long they were successful and every year had potential world champions, if not major winners. But the problem the Norwegian scene had was it essentially had disadvantages in almost every area of the scene, which ultimately were crippling in terms of being able to meet those expectations and unlock the potential I just described of being maybe the second greatest Counter-Strike nation in history. Instead, even within the Scandinavian, Nordic region, Denmark outstripped them with the early success of Spirit of Amiga, and then later on with MTW. Denmark being the best team in the world, winning majors, being the best team of the year back in 2008, going to 2009, later on having a very good team in 2010. No Norwegian team ever won a major. No Norwegian team was ever even a contender for Team of the Year. This is how underwhelming their accomplishments actually were. Now, one of the first reasons as to why the Norwegian scene was always limited in terms of the success it could have had is not that they didn't have the players, because they had some of the greatest and most decorated, even most successful players in the history of Counter-Strike. Element, many world championships, many times in the best team in the world, many times one of the most impactful players in the entire world. Executor, one of the original gods of the game for the first 3 or 4 years. Fantastic performances, always around the top scene, making teams win events, showing off fantastic individual play in clutch rounds, winning games with his tactical brain. Real is one of the most skilled players we have ever seen in this game. If you want to talk about pure skill and ability, this guy's top 10 all time, any version of CS. Nikon, a guy who's a very good, stable player, lockdown CT position player. Think of a Crims of his day. They had all these players in terms of like star type names, but then you could even go role by role, and they always had players at every type of role and position in Counter-Strike. So what are some of the reasons as to why these players didn't get into teams and didn't have the success that they could have had? Well, one reason is that from very early on, the Swedish scene cannibalized the best Norwegian players, because to some degree the Norwegian players could understand Swedish, and so they could play in these teams. So in the early days, we had Executor, the best Norwegian player at the time. In 2000, 2001, he went off and played with NIP, was part of one of their very good teams. Then he was in SK, also with Heaton and Poddy of NIP. Then later on, after Eolithic, the Norwegian team, he was in Team 9, which was Vestlund team and Quick and those guys. So he was in some of the best Swedish teams ever. And yet he's one of the best Norwegians ever. At that point in time, was the best player in history. Then you look at Dark, a guy where in 2002, Vestlund, leader of Team 9, said, this guy's the best player in the world. So the best player in the world is Norwegian at one point in time. We're talking like March, April 2002. And where is he playing? Well, he's off playing in Nordic Division, which later became Esports United, later became Team 9 when Vestlund took over the team. He was playing after that in SK Scandinavia with Executor, and then the Swedes of Heaton and Potty and Zenon. This was a guy where he'd been in one of the best Norwegian teams, Massive Attack in 2001, but then he goes over to all these Swedish teams, then he goes to Four Kings, then later on he's in NOA that's like mixed with Swedes, and yeah, he was in Eolithic for a brief while, but his best success came outside of Eolithic. Then you look at Element, again, someone who was the best player in the world at one point in time, probably like mid-2003, certainly one of the most impactful players ever because of his incredible ability to read the game and as a result to always be in the right place at the right time and make crazy plays despite not having the maddest aim. Here's a guy where his best success came outside of Norwegian teams. He was in the Game Online teams that reached the final of the 2 majors in 2002 with different lineups. He was in the SK 2003 lineup, which took over from what took him from Eolithic and then became the best team in history until about 6 or so years later. Maybe 7 years later. No, maybe 5 years later, actually. So became at the time the most dominant team in history, won an incredible run of winning essentially every tournament after ESWC. Incredible performance, and yet his success came outside of Eolithic. Then he was in NOA and won championships there. Again, not an entirely Norwegian team. Then we think of, in latter days, we had Calais, who we're talking about like 2010, 2011, was the best Norwegian player left because Real had really pieced out on the game. So where's he playing? Not in Norway. He's going off and he's playing in ESC, this team that had Moddy in and had Pronax and those guys. That's why Kalle was off playing, using his talents for a Swedish/Scandinavian/Nordic mix. There's also the fact that lineups just simply didn't stick together due to sponsor issues. Sponsor issues always got in the way. Now, yes, the Norwegian economy is far different to the other European countries. Like, Sweden's considered an expensive country where the cost of living is quite high. Norway's like twice that. So, understandably, it's hard to get the funds to support these teams. And most of the Swedish teams didn't play for Swedish organisations. They played for German organisations or other organisations, American later on. Well, actually, not so much, I guess, in 1.6. So, we think of some of the great lineups. We had Massive Attack. This team that was one of the best teams in the world in 2001, went to the major. They had to break up at some point in 2002. Their best player left Dark. The team spread apart. Then you have Spacebar. Not an amazing team. They fell down a little bit at CPL Summer 2002, but a solid team. Had the core ingredients of what would later become Eolithic, but split apart from that organisation because of a dispute with the in-game leader in BSL and the cafe Spacebar. So then we had Eolithic, which came out of Spacebar. The first two lineups were very good lineups who didn't quite prove themselves. Then you go into 2003, they make the God tier lineup, the one that has Dark and Executor and Element all in one team. Incredible team lineup that had the potential to be one of the greatest lineups of all time. Like, if the team could play together for 3 years and all be motivated and play every tournament, they might have been like a top 10 team of all time. Instead, they're not even close because they never won a big tournament together with that lineup. They just had some good runs and some good online performances. So there's another one that split apart. And what people don't know is, yes, they split apart because Element left and went to SK and made SK a superpower, but it was also because of this sponsor issue. Even though they had Esports United helping them, they never had proper sponsorship. They never went to CPL Cologne earlier that year. SK was allowed to go and win that for free because they didn't have the money to do so. So they split apart shortly before ESWC. Then you have Team 9, the Norwegian one in 2005, where they had all these young guys who were up-and-comers, specifically, mainly Real, but also Oops was very good as well. Real was this 15-year-old phenom who was fucking incredible at the game. And he pretty much hard carried them to a CPL Europe title where they beat out teams like the field was like NIP, Hurai, the Finnish guys, SK Gaming, obviously. All these sick teams, and they managed to beat them out. Actually, was Hurai there? I don't know. Actually, might have got that one wrong. Let me think. So yeah, Team 9... they were a team you wanted to see what would happen to them. They had to split apart because the sponsorship wasn't there. So they split apart into two different teams, basically. They took the talent of the team and they split into two different directions and halved the talent. And as a result, they didn't have a top team to the same degree. Then you look at the fact that this economical aspect also affected the viability of the top players to be pros. As in, they would have other options they thought were better at the time because they weren't getting such sick salary, or they were very good players but didn't have a good team at the time, or the right teammate that chose to retire at the wrong time, so they got lack of motivation. So we think of Kalle. He was always having school issues where he wanted to focus on that to some degree. Then we think of Real, the best player in the history of the Norwegian scene in terms of skill and ability. He's a guy who, when he got tired of the teams not being good enough around him, when enough of his teammates had retired, he went off and played poker instead. Then we talk about Dark, fantastic player, very intelligent, had a pedigree going back into Quake 2, team success there with the old Memento Mori lineup with Shub. This is a guy where the reason he went to join Four Kings is so he could go to a high-class school in the UK. Schooling was more important. He'd played a few years as a pro. He wasn't going to keep playing more. So you can see that the economical aspect did affect it in a way that it wouldn't affect you if you're from Germany or from, let's say, France or something. There's also the fact that the wrong moves by the best players set the scene back sometimes. So when I said that Team 9, like those young guys who came up together on the back of Real, split apart, the problem is Real chose the wrong one. He chose to go to Catch Gamer, which was BSL, and it was Juvenile. Juvenile was a good player at the time, and he took Oops with him, who was the other best player out of Team 9, and they had Nikon eventually as the fifth guy, but he was kind of past his skills there. He was just a very basic team player. So that was an okay lineup. Problem is, he could have gone over to NOA, and NOA ended up making a hybrid team of Norwegians and Danes, but they could have made an all-Norwegian lineup that would have been sick, because they ended up having Executor, and then they took PRB and Zion out of Team 9. And PRB was like the third best player, and Zion was just okay. Jungle Bobo was terrible, but he was kicked out of the team. So if instead Real and Oops go and join up this team, so it's Executor, PRB, Zion, Real, Oops, that would be a fantastic team, potential world champion, with Executor as the in-game leader, Real as a star player, Oops as a solid player, PRB is a solid player. You'd have a fantastic run, and you have a proper in-game leader with a lot of history. They didn't do that because Real didn't want to go and play with Executor. He didn't like him, so he went over to the other team, the not as good team in theory, and split the talent apart instead. Then 2007, Oops, the second best player in the scene, the guy who really should have been like the duo partner, as it were, of Real during his prime, so that they'd both be on fire and they'd both be the two core talents. He retires in early, I think it was early, I'm trying to remember when now. I think it was sometime in 2007. He retired way too early, basically. And this is a guy where he should have been playing a couple more years, and then Real could have been more engaged in the scene. I mean, you have to realize at this point in time, Real was only something like 17, 18 himself. Then they have the personality issues. And I don't mean as in individual people who have issues with their personality. I mean as in clashes of personality between key people who need to play together. So Executor and Element were one of the best combos ever. I mean, I'll link my video up here about Eolithic, where I explained they were fantastic together. They were absolutely amazing when they played in Eolithic together, when they were still in their primes individually. And then later on, when they were way past their primes, still phenomenal as a core within NOA, because Element could read the game. Executor was one of the best strat callers and at preparing strats. So he could call based on what Element had read, and they had this amazing 1-2 punch that would allow them to take over games. You know the problem, though? These two guys, the two most accomplished players in the history of Norwegian Counter-Strike, hated each other, couldn't get along. So they got along for a brief while, split apart. Got along for a brief while, split apart. Even in NOA, they couldn't stay together, even though they had this fantastic chemistry. It's because it was that creative tension. It was that Lennon and McCartney type scenario. It was that Morrissey and Marr type songwriting, creative tension style situation where it was working and the tension between the two kept them fantastic, but that's also the reason why it couldn't stay together. They had that magnetic repulsion to each other to some degree. Then you have Knoxville and BSL. Here's a guy where he was a solid leader with a good head on his shoulders, BSL, but Knoxville was his role player who was always conniving, who was always getting a cut from teams, who was always backstabbing, who was always using the short-term logic to get someone else in. So because these guys never stuck together, they could never make their own separate team and be really good and have another good team in Norway. Then we have Real and Executor. The greatest in-game leader in the history of the country, Executor, fantastic tactician, very good at setting up teams, structuring teams, all the history and all the decorated medals and accomplishments, and the greatest player in terms of skill doesn't want to play with him, won't partner with him, won't learn from him, won't play under his system. And so as a result, we never got to see what could have happened with an Executor system powered by Real skills. That would have been fantastic. Never got to see it, ever. There was no proper lineage within the scene. So BSL quit after Catch Gamer, basically, and then he just became a background person in the scene, and he'd already kind of been a little bit dissed by some of the players and who didn't want to play with him, so he wasn't in a position to show these new guys the way forwards for the next 3 years after that. Execute, who was done after NOA in 2006, and after the way people like Real had not wanted to play with him, and the fact Element's kind of out of the picture at this point in time, how is he going to help anyone? How is he going to work with anyone? So he just disappears off, he goes to Korea a bunch. Element, fantastic player, amazing sense for the game, played with nearly all the great players in history who were Norwegian. It's not really a leadership type of person. He's just like a friendly type of guy. And then he's someone who's kind of fickle. Like he's going to move around from team to team and he's going to be into someone for a few months and he's going to fall out. He's going to go away to another guy instead. Not enough of a leader in terms of the morale sense of things or being an example. And he ended up being too inactive once it became like 2006 to 2007. Then he had players who were just caught out of time. Real's fantastic peak. Yes, he was phenomenal when he was 15, but your peak's going to come when you've got a bit of maturity, a bit more experience. You've played with players, you learn how to use your support players, learn how to play within a tactical system, learn how to have all the pressure on you at the top level and never crumble. By the time he was 17, 18, when he was hitting his real prime, all his teammates had retired and he was left for lineups that weren't very good and they didn't have proper sponsorship and they lost their sponsorship over in the polls in MYM and all sorts of issues that went on. And he tried again for a year or two on and off, but never had the right situation present itself. He even had times where some of the Swedish teams like Fnatic were considering him, but then they went with just Swedish players instead. Kalle, his problem is he was too far apart from Real. He's someone who should have been like the Oops to Real's Real, obviously, and should have been that second-in-command guy who was very good and was the duo partner of the Crims to his Olaf Meister as it was. But he was too many years afterwards. By the time Kalle came around and got into his prime around 2011, Real was already long gone by then. And anytime he did come back, he was never going to come back seriously. He was off in poker. You look at the accomplishments of the Norwegian scene with the Norwegian teams, not as players, because I told you, players like Element and Execute incredibly decorated outside of the Norwegian scene. Within the Norwegian scene, you look at what Norwegian teams accomplished, and even what they accomplished just hints at the potential that was there. So in 2001, we had the first huge major for CS, the World Championship in December of 2001. First place, $50,000. Second place, $25,000. Massive prize pool, 128 teams or more competing there in Dallas, Texas. Massive Attack goes there. They won a qualifier in Norway, and they win They come 4th place. They finished above every North American team except Extreme 3, the best NA team, and they finished 3rd out of the Europeans. Had a fantastic run there. But then the team breaks up. Part of the reason the team breaks up, well, a Meridia team, which was Element and Damien and all those guys, came along, and at GameSphere 2002, earlier on in the year, they managed a mad upset where they beat out Game Online that had Vestlin in it, and they beat out Massive Attack, this lineup I'm telling you about. They beat those teams out and they won this LAN. So you think, wow, what's that team going to become? Well, that team essentially becomes Spacebar, but Element leaves. Element just goes straight off and joins Game Online, and he was the best player at the time, so they're diminished already. Eolithic finally comes together with some of those players back with Element. They win CPL Oslo. You're thinking, wow, I can't wait to see them challenge against SK. Lineup doesn't last. Element gets kicked out because they want to bring in Executor and Dark from SK. So now Element's gone and he's one of the best players, but now we've got Executor and Dark in. So they come along. They win Mindtrekland, the European qualifier in 2002. They go to the CPL and they flunk it and they finish in 8th place. They come back home, they win the Euro Cup. You're like, oh, they're still dangerous. They can still be the best team in the world. Lineup doesn't last. They kick out it's a circuitous method, but eventually they manage to get Element in. So you're like, right, now they've got the all-time super team. This is when they should be one of the best teams of all time. They get 2nd place Click Arena. They beat SK Gaming 6 out of 7 times, including a bunch of online games. You're thinking this is a very dangerous team. They split apart because of sponsorship issues. Element goes and joins the people that he'd just beaten 6 out of 7 times, SK, and makes them the greatest team in the world, the greatest team of all time at that point in time. A couple of years later, Team 9 rises up out of nowhere. They win CPL UK stop. They finished 3rd at WEG Season 3 ahead of NIP of Heaton and Potty, those incredibly decorated players. Team splits apart. They go into NOA, they go into Catch Gamer. Even those teams have success. NOA manages this shocking win where they win SHG Open early in 2006. But then after that, accomplished pretty much nothing of real value. Catch Gamer have an okay result. They go to the WEG Masters Super Stack Tournament in China, where first place is $70,000. They have a really good performance. It's all killer teams there. The back-to-back 2005 CPL champions of SK are there and go out in the group stage. Virtus Pro there go out in the group stage. We have the Solos Istro team coming to, they're actually called Hacker PK at the time. We have WNV who won the tournament. We had Complexity with Fraud. Incredibly stacked tournament. They finished 4th. They got really good accounting for themselves in this best of 3 unique series format that happens in the tournament. 4th place. Pretty solid, right? Beyond that, it's just downhill. Then you have MYM Norway, which was, it was Element for a time, and it was real. Finally, we're getting back to a really good team, right? They make this miracle run to the final of CPL Winter 2006. Get smashed by Fnatic there. But okay, you're thinking, right, if they can build on that. They come 3rd at SEC 2007. A few months later, 3 months later. SEC was the Samsung European Championships, a European version of the World Cyber Games, basically. But obviously, Europe was incredibly skilled at the time, so it's very hard. Now, 3rd sounds good, right? That's pretty good. Problem is, they were in the winners bracket final. And then they got upset by SK in this miracle match. Then they lost to the Poles, who they'd already smashed earlier in the tournament. So 3rd was actually the worst they should have finished. They should have been in the final, or maybe even won that tournament. Unsurprising, Oops retires, right? Then you had, even years later, 2008, when all these guys haven't been playing, they come back together just to fuck around, Element, Real, a few of these people. They come back and make a team, CB team it's called, clan-based team. And they make it a team and they manage to qualify for Norway. And they go to the World Cyber Games for 2008, years after some of these guys' prime. And they make a miracle run where they get to the semi-finals and they almost beat the guys who win the tournament, the best team in the world, one of the best teams of all time, MTW Denmark. It's an amazing 3-game series. Second map, they're close to winning it. They're even on some mad like 14-14 type situation, or 14-13 where they're on like the others are on some force buy. They almost win it, they don't. And then they even lose the 3rd place game to the Koreans and they finish 4th. And almost got a medal there despite being a team that essentially just came together out of nowhere, played the tournament. That just shows you the kind of embarrassment of riches and talent and luxury of incredible players that Norway had. And yet, as good as some of these results are, yeah, if you were a lesser country like France, these would be wicked results. These are terrible results for what they could have been, the 2nd greatest nation of all time. Even in CSGO, they've just never been able to accomplish anything close to that. They never had an elite team in CSGO. The best team they had in CSGO was London Conspiracy, which for one tournament, Gfinity G3, made it to the round of 8, won a map off, I think it was Virtus Pro. Was it Virtus Pro? Did they play Mouse Sports? I think it was Virtus Pro they played. I think so. So they won a map there. They never made it further than that. Never had another performance like that from a Norwegian team. We had Rain go over to Kingwin, become briefly maybe even a top 10, top 15 player in the world over that summer of 2015. And then he leveled off a bit, and he had become the in-game leader now of what's phase, and it's not really that impressive. We had Jacob have this breakout at DreamHack London with Copenhagen Wolves, and we're like, wow, is this guy going to go somewhere? He joins up with what was then G2. They make it to the semis of the DreamHack Cluj-Napoca Major off the back of his play, where he's playing all-star MVP level Counter-Strike. They're one round away from going to the final. They don't do it. And after that, he's in the lineup. He's just okay at that point in time. He's never that superstar again. There's just been nothing comparable in CSGO to what they had in 1.6 and the potential in 1.6. They've never been able to deliver on that again. So you know what? I don't want to rain on your parade. But if you want to earn some real money, then get on over to Alpha Draft and play fantasy esports there. Catch the right gamers and put them in your lineup, and you could win any number of contests for the different leagues and lands in CS. Pick the wrong people, and you could end up thinking, oops, what have I done? The element of surprise, though, is always present with the unexpected outcomes that happen in fantasy sports. But you could be super lucky, BSL, and win as a result of the unexpected nature. That's what's fun. Start a massive attack on that Alpha Draft Skrilla and get out of a dark place today.